Thank you to the organizers for extending the invitation. I'm super excited to talk today about artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. And in keeping with the theme of the conference about Confluence, I'll talk about the confluence of these two very, very exciting fields. Now, over the course of the next 20 minutes, I'll touch upon a few topics. I'll start off by talking about how the overall cybersecurity landscape is evolving. What are some of the major market trends, the mega trends, if you will? Then I'll talk about the role that artificial intelligence and machine learning can play in the context of cybersecurity. And this will not be a typical AI machine learning talk. I will not talk about how AI and machine learning will solve world peace, how it will save the whales, how it's going to cure the common cold. I'll talk about some of the challenges that occur when you start to apply AI and ML in these specific domains around security. Which is not to say that it's a bad application. I think there's actually a lot you can do with these techniques, but I think there are some major open problems to consider. I'll then talk about some emerging areas within cybersecurity where AI is playing a more and more critical role, and then make some concluding remarks. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. When you look at the overall market landscape in general in security, one of the main trends to consider is modernization. Now, we live in an increasingly hyper-connected world. Our supply chains are interlinked. Our reliance on third parties has never been greater. No single organization exists as an isolated entity unto itself. Instead, every organization exists as part of something much bigger. And when you have these complex, hyper-connected systems, a small failure in one part of the system can have a cascading ripple effect in other parts of the system. And that ripple effect can lead to some very profound consequences. Consider, for example, that one of the biggest data breaches in history occurred because third-party hackers were able to obtain a single password for a third-party HVAC system on the customer premise and use that system to steal many tens of millions of credit card numbers. Consider that the cyber attack on the Democratic National Committee ultimately caused people to question the very foundations of the democratic process. Consider that the makers of Wi-Fi baby cams became unwitting accessories to the world's largest distributed denial of service attack when those baby cams were compromised and co-opted in scale as part of something called the Mirai botnet and were used to take down, to bring to its knees, some of the sites that we rely on a daily basis. The explosion of technology is only beginning. We see it today, and we're going to continue to see it in the future. Just a few years ago, a pair of researchers were able to remotely control and stop a sports utility vehicle while it was driving. What happens a few years from now when there are millions of autonomous vehicles on the road and someone can control them at once, make them stop at once, or make them go in a common direction at one time? Innovation invites exploitation. Human ingenuity is a powerful thing. Modernization, in turn, can indeed breed malice. So we're seeing that sometimes small failures can lead to mega failures in the context of hyperconnectivity. But beyond that, these mega failures in turn lead to mega scrutiny. Security is no longer just an isolated technology problem. It has become a business concern. We're seeing for the first time publicly traded companies cite as part of their earnings calls that cyber attacks have had a detrimental impact on their bottom line. It's a brand new world order, and that trend will only continue with the advent of mandates. Compliance regimes like the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, plan to impose a fine of 20 million euros, or 4% of revenue, whichever is greater, for any organization that fails to adequately protect the private information of European Union citizens. Now, GDPR doesn't just impact people in Europe. It could impact people from Santa Clara to Sydney to Shanghai. As long as you control or deal with or process any private data of EU citizens, you could be susceptible. And with the advent of modernization, of malice, and of mandates, we have to think of new ways, of innovative ways to deal with the question of cybersecurity. And one of those ways is through the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Now, by the way, machine learning and AI in many ways are tailor-made to deal with cybersecurity issues. think about what happens in cybersecurity. You've got someone who has a bunch of data. They use that data to derive context, use that context to make a decision about whether or not what's in front of them is good or bad. You can imagine trying to apply automation techniques, leveraging AI and ML, towards being able to make those types of intelligent decisions. And in fact, this is not new. We know that AI and ML have been talked about in the research community for more than half a century, and they've been used in a cybersecurity context for at least a decade and a half and beyond that in actual production environments. For example, if you get any email online, whether you're using a web-based email provider or a local exchange instance, your email goes through a spam filter. Spam filters today apply artificial intelligence and machine learning to be able to identify spam emails. They may look at factors like the keywords in the emails. Does it say the word Rolex or Viagra? They may look at where the email came from to understand the domain and its reputation. They may look at who actually sent the email and what country they were in. And by applying a variety of signals, make an intelligent decision about whether that email should be allowed through or should be kept at bay. Now, sometimes they'll be wrong. We've always found out that one email that was caught by the spam filter didn't make it to our inbox. But more often than not, these systems are fairly correct. A second place where we've seen AI and ML be used is in the context of online fraud. How many people here do some form of online banking with the US-based bank? Okay, so if you do that type of thing, there's a very good chance, in fact, there's a close to 100% chance, there's some AI and ML happening to protect that transaction. It's something we know because we've built some of those systems at RSA. Now, here's the secret about online banking. Your bank doesn't care if you type the right password in when you logged in. And the reason they don't care is they assume that somebody other than you knows your password. And you know what? That's probably a pretty good assumption for most people. And so what banks do is they look at every other aspect of the transaction. What time of day did you log in? Where did you log in from? What set of actions did you take once you logged into your bank account? And it turns out that those behaviors, those attributes, are a much more reliable indicator that you are who you say you are than your actual password is. And by being able to combine those attributes, applying machine learning techniques to those attributes, banks are able to make an intelligent decision about whether to let you through and make a particular transaction. It's been happening now for a decade and a half in actual production environments. We use AI and ML to identify malicious software, things like computer viruses. Again, you can look at the attributes of a file, you can look at the behaviors of the software on your system, and determine whether or not those behaviors seem to be nefarious or whether they're benign. We've also applied AI and ML in actual production environments at RSA in the context of network traffic. In fact, in one case, we were able to use these techniques to identify that a particular government was being attacked by another government. Now, by the way, if you want to be able to detect those types of attacks, you can't rely on traditional cybersecurity techniques because you're truly looking for anomalous behaviors. You're looking for the unknown unknowns. And again, we're seeing AI and ML play a really, really prominent role in these areas. So I've talked about how great AI and ML are. Now I'm going to talk about all the places they fail. One of the key things that happens in AI and ML is you need good data to begin with. And it's amazing how many people get this wrong. The whole problem is garbage in, garbage out. If you start with good data, you can make good inferences. If you don't have good data, there's pretty much no hope. And in the Bay Area, I say you can't make good wine from bad grapes. The same concept applies to cybersecurity. Ultimately, the data we use to make inferences has to be representative of what we will actually encounter in the field when applying any type of interesting algorithm. Now, what's surprising is people get this wrong in a really deep way. In fact, I say you start off with good data, you figure out what you need to look at in that data, the features that are relevant to the domain of the problem you're solving, and then you build your fancy classifier that figures out how to take those features and combine them in a way that gives you an interesting outcome. What you'll typically see in a lot of organizations, they'll talk about how many layers are in their neural network. They'll talk about how they are applying principal components analysis, or they're doing singular value decomposition, how they have 11 PhDs working on this problem. What they'll typically not tell you is where their data is coming from. And I'll give you a hint. You can have the best algorithm in the world, but without good data, it does not matter. And by the way, if you have the right data and the right features, most off-the-shelf algorithms perform within maybe 1% or a fraction of a percent of each other. It's a common problem that people tend to ignore. The second thing that comes up in cybersecurity is what I call class imbalance. Now, in cybersecurity, Most things we deal with are benign. Most credit card transactions in the world are not fraudulent. Most files on my computer, in fact, probably all of them, I hope, are fine. They're benign. Cybersecurity is often about finding that needle in the haystack, finding that one malicious act in a sea of a lot of legitimacy. And by the way, machine learning algorithms can get caught up in this problem because they're trying to find the one bad thing. They've got to avoid calling all the good things bad by accident. They have to avoid what we call a false positive. Now, in a cybersecurity context, false positives are really, really crucial. I'll give you one example. One of our biggest customers manages security for one of the most prominent airports in the world. If we mislabel a transaction as malicious and we're wrong, that means a plane can't take off. There's a serious operational implication for being wrong. And if you talk to most companies, for them a false positive is a very, very serious thing. If you accidentally identify something as bad when it's good, you may actually stop operations. You may actually have a clear business line impact. And so the idea of thinking about class imbalance in the context of AI and cybersecurity becomes ever more crucial. The third thing to consider in cybersecurity is that we're dealing with sentient adversaries, threat actors who are constantly adapting. Imagine playing a sport like bowling. Okay? If you're trying to bowl, you've got 10 pins that are in front of you, and you can apply the same technique more or less repeatedly. You figure out how to throw the ball, you figure out the angles, the velocity, you can knock the pins down. Then the goal becomes to repeat the process over and over and over again. If you try to apply that same strategy to a sport like soccer, it wouldn't work. The team that wins the World Cup in a given year can't use the exact same strategy the following year because everyone else will adapt to their strategy. The threat actors we deal with are sentient. They'll constantly maneuver what they're doing. They'll constantly make changes. And by the way, a lot of AI and ML techniques don't do well in the face of active adversaries. A lot of techniques in AI and ML assume that we're dealing with data that is legitimate and constant and representative of the real world. But threat actors may have a different idea in mind. Now, by the way, there are ways to address the situation. You can do things like retraining or weight your more recent data heavily. There are techniques like transfer learning or inductive transfer. But these techniques are very nascent in the academic community. And it's really an open question of how much we'll be able to push the envelope when it comes to dealing with truly sentient adversaries who are trying to intentionally trip up our systems. But there's still a lot of application. I mean, there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit that people aren't addressing in cybersecurity where AI techniques can be quite powerful. Now, when it comes to sentient adversaries, we've got to think about not just the world today, but what it looks like in the future. Think about something like a self-driving car. There was a really remarkable research paper recently that was published where someone was able to take some masking tape and use it to confuse a self-driving car. By putting tape in the right places on a sign, you could confuse a car into thinking that the sign said something completely different. Again, AI and ML systems aren't often designed to deal with adversarial behavior. Now, there is some still ray of hope. We're seeing threat actors use AI and ML as well. Maybe there's a Confluence conference somewhere else where you have AI and ML people on the bad side figuring out how to use some of these techniques. And one example of that is in solving something called a CAPTCHA. How many people have gone to a website and it tells you, type in this sequence of characters and numbers, and if you type it in correctly, we'll let you create an account? How many times have you not been able to type it in correctly because the thing is so small and so convoluted that, yeah, and it's getting worse, right? By the way, AI and ML techniques can solve this problem much better than humans. And it turns out someone's figured out how to exploit that. There's a threat actor who created a website saying, if you want to create fake accounts, maybe for spam or other bad purposes, I'll offer you a SaaS service where I'll actually compute these things for you. And some of these systems, I mean, it's amazing what these threat actors do. They have customer support. They have 24/7 numbers where you can call if you can't use the service correctly, and they'll actually help you. By the way, a long time ago, I did see one attack toolkit, and I actually tried to call this customer support number for it. A hacker picked up the phone on the other end, and then I freaked out and hung up because there's no reason I should be calling this guy in the middle of the night, and the FBI might come find me afterwards. So luckily, that didn't happen. But there is actually a real business opportunity for some of the threat actors in this space. There are also interesting opportunities for all of us to try to think about novel ways to deal with some of these threats. Here's one I saw recently. How many people here have been offered $20 million by a Nigerian prince if you comply and you give them all your information? Okay, we all have, right? Now, a number of years ago, somebody had a funny idea. He said, you know what? what if I respond to this Nigerian prince and express my interest in getting this $20 million? And I just troll them for a while. I just keep distracting them. I ask them a bunch of questions. While I'm doing that, that poor threat actor is not able to go and actually compromise somebody else. Just like how many people get a telemarketing call and you put the person on hold because you don't want to just deal with them, and you figure that if I do that, I'm going to prevent them from talking to somebody else. Now, by the way, that exact problem I talked about interacting with threat actors to delay them, can be automated through AI and ML. And somebody actually built a chatbot to do that. They took some of these spam emails that they were getting from Nigerian princes. They found ways to automatically reply to those emails and engage these threat actors in a way that would at least distract them from compromising other people. Now, of course, the reality is that if they can do that, I'm sure the threat actors can figure out ways to build other chatbots on their end. So we'll see what happens. Maybe we'll have AI talking to AI at the end of all this. Now, I want to close by telling you a personal story of my relationship with AI and machine learning in the context of cybersecurity. And my background is I've spent a lot of time building systems that are in production, have been used to catch millions of threats online, billions of transactions. But there's one particular indication to me about some of the challenges in the space. So a number of years ago, I was working on a system that could figure out whether or not a file was good or bad, if it had a high reputation, based on who created the file. Was it a legitimate, well-known publisher, or was it somebody who was unknown? And my idea was the following. I had a bunch of data on files. And if I could figure out whether the file had a high reputation, maybe it's on a million systems and those systems have no bad behavior, then I could say whoever signed that file, whoever created it, is probably a legitimate creator. And vice versa. If I see files out there that are weird looking and on one system in the world, whoever created that file, I can infer is probably not somebody good. And so I started building a system that could try to use AI and ML to figure out whether files are good or bad, based on whether the person developing them were good or bad, and then use that in turn to figure out who all the software publishers in the world were, and whether or not they had good behaviors and whatnot. And so I started collecting a bunch of data. I started putting the data in a spreadsheet. And what I found is that you had some files out there that were very popular. And lo and behold, the people who published those files were very well-known people, like Microsoft and Adobe, and just really well-known publishers. Then you had a certain segment of files that had weird behaviors. They were on one system here and there. Those systems seemed to act really funny in certain situations. And lo and behold, those files were published by people who were known to do bad things, people who were trying to write adware or spyware, things that might spy on your computer or try to generate ads and things like that, really interfere with your process. But on my spreadsheet, there was one line, and I vividly remember, it was line 23 of my spreadsheet. There was a publisher who had files that were both popular and then a whole bunch of one-off files, like all over the world. And I couldn't figure out, like, why would this happen? Why would there be this one publisher with a bunch of popular things and then a whole bunch of one-offs? It just didn't compute in my head. And so I thought about it for a while. I thought maybe this is a data integrity issue earlier in the stack. I spent some time, and then I kind of gave up. I left the company, did a startup, and forgot all about this spreadsheet. But a few months later, I started reading about a threat called Stuxnet. How many of you have heard of Stuxnet? Stuxnet was the first military-grade cyber weapon. It was used as part of trying to take down the Iran nuclear power facility by compromising the centrifuges in that facility, modifying their fan speed so the actual fan would break down. It was a remarkably sophisticated threat. Stuxnet was digitally signed. It had a publisher. It was digitally signed by what seemed to be a legitimate publisher, Realtek Systems. Line 23 of my spreadsheet. So here I was in cybersecurity, and I thought I knew all about this field. And here I was staring at the first military-grade cyber weapon months before anybody even knew it existed. But I couldn't see why it was malicious. I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't understand what it was that was going on in that scenario. It was a true unknown unknown. Now, when you think about AI and machine learning techniques, they're really good at expanding our scope of knowledge, but they typically rely on us to put in either rules or to start with data. When you deal with an instance that's so far beyond the norm that we can't conceive of it, it starts to become outside the realm of what AI and machine learning can help us with. So I think AI and machine learning in general, very powerful techniques. I think they have actual applications in cybersecurity. But they're not a panacea. There are ways to co-opt these techniques. And if you've got sophisticated threat actors, there are ways to move around them. And there are ways to implement machine learning and AI incorrectly. Now, having said that, technologies that are really powerful like AI and ML continue to improve. We've already seen a lot of advances in enabling cybersecurity techniques with AI and ML. but we're just at the beginning. It's incumbent upon us, when I mean us, I mean the people in this room, I mean all of you, to understand how to use these technologies responsibly. And by the way, that sentiment applies not just to AI and ML, but to any technology, any concept that the human mind can conceive of in the future. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you very much. Have a great lunch.